Last week at this time, during our Torah reading, we listened as one of the incredible teens in our community chanted Parashat Yitro, which concludes with the experience of revelation at Mount Sinai and the giving of the Ten Commandments. And last week, as it does every single year without fail, the ritual that we did when we got to that passage moved me really deeply. As we turned the page from chapter 19 into chapter 20, the entire congregation stood up. It's one of the only times in the Torah reading cycle when this happens. And we heard once again those mitzvot that sit at the very core of our tradition. Honor Shabbat, don't steal, don't bear false witness against your neighbor. The Israelites are meeting God for the very first time. And out of the smoke and the lightning and the thunder of that scene on Mount Sinai emerges this divine vision of what the foundations of a holy society might look like. And then we turn the page again, or a couple more pages, and we arrive at this week's Parsha of Mishpatim, which is mostly comprised of very detailed day-to-day laws relating to civic life that are designed to keep society functioning, especially when it seems like things might be about to go off the rails. So when two people end up in a fist fight, and one strikes the other and causes him an injury, for example, what happens? If my ox gores someone, who gets punished more, me or the ox? And of course, it depends on whether the ox makes a habit of goring or whether this was a one-off goring occasion. According to many commentaries, this collection of very practical law is directly connected to what came before it in the Ten Commandments. All of this is part of one revelation. Revelation's not just about standing in awe before God at Sinai, but also about these nitty-gritty details for how to build a society where every moment of our daily lives is shaped by that same kind of holiness. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks once wrote in a Dvar Torah, "The greatness of Judaism is not simply in its noble vision of a free, just, and compassionate society, but in the way that it brings this vision down to earth in detailed legislation. God is to be found in the innermost depths of the human soul, but God is equally to be found in the public square and in structures of society, the marketplace, the corridors of power, and the courts of law." Some of the ways in which our Parsha answers questions about marketplace and power and courts gel pretty naturally with how we might instinctively answer those questions today. So going back to the fight, if two people end up in a fight and one strikes the other and causes him an injury, we learn that the guilty party needs to compensate the injured party for their medical care and for their lost wages during the time that they're recuperating. So justice here is not abstract, it's very practical, it's restorative, and it makes a lot of sense to us. But the Parsha also contains laws that shock us with their apparent distance from our own moral intuition. And maybe no law in Mishpatim does this more than the very first. The Parsha opens like this. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he is to serve you for 6 years, and in the 7th year he shall go free, without paying anything. If the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children and do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door of the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl, and then he will be his servant for life. After the moral grandeur of last week's Parsha, these verses stop us in our tracks. Because wasn't the whole point of the story up until now freedom? The slavery of the Israelites in Egypt was such an affront to God that God stepped into history and brought them out of bondage. So surely in this moment of Jewish history, in the midst of Revelation, as this new social order is taking shape, God could have just abolished slavery. How could it be that the institution of slavery is upheld, even within its prescribed new conditions? One way to understand this law about owning Israelite slaves is that the Torah here is not describing a utopia that appears overnight, but rather the glimmers of the beginning of a very long moral trajectory. The Israelites are emerging from a world in which slavery was universal and unquestioned. And rather than erasing it in a single stroke, the Torah begins to dismantle its permanence, its inevitability, its cruelty, setting in motion a slow but powerful reorientation towards freedom. At least for the Israelite slaves, slavery in these verses ceases to be a permanent status, and it becomes a temporary condition. An Israelite slave goes free after 6 years, and slaves who choose to stay on with their masters seem to get punished, or at least publicly marked with that ear piercing, as individuals who are in some ways upsetting the natural progression out of slavery that God is trying to set up. In this light, we can read the Torah's approach to slavery as a quantum leap forward. It's no longer what you are or who you were born to, but something that has happened to you for a period of time. But if you feel deeply dissatisfied by the answer I just gave to what the institution of slavery is doing in our Parsha, you are not alone. The tension is just inescapable. On the one hand, limits are placed on it. On the other hand, there it is. Sometimes what troubles us today also troubled the rabbis of the Talmud. Slavery is never abolished entirely in the Talmud, but the rabbis clearly wrestled with it very deeply, asking fundamental questions about its morality and adding a lot of new guardrails to its practice. And there are lots of examples, some in this week's Parsha, where the rabbis reinterpret a particular law in the Torah based on their own moral intuition. For example, if someone gets blinded or gets a tooth knocked out in that fight, is that injustice really remedied by an equal and opposite reaction, an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, which appears in this week's Parsha? No, the rabbis say. Of course that would be barbaric and stand at odds with the moral endeavor of the Torah. And through the magic of rabbinic hermeneutics, an eye for an eye becomes understood as referring to monetary compensation for physical damages. Then there are moments when the rabbis go even further than this just kind of reinterpretation of a law, and they enact what's called a takana, a decree designed to actually change, not just reinterpret, but change something in the law in response to an urgent ethical or social need. So a great example is Rabbi Hillel's creation of the Prose Bowl during the time of the Mishnah, which was kind of a restructuring of the Torah's debt law that better protected both borrowers and lenders during the Shemitah year. And then in the 11th century, Rabbeinu Gershom prohibited divorcing a woman against her will, which was a major change in the tradition that instituted to bring about more justice and more protection for women in vulnerable situations. And this great project of halakha, of reinterpretation and ethical recalibration, continues up until today. The Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, which is the rabbinic body of the conservative movement that puts out really deeply researched responses to modern halakhic questions, grapples with issues of our own time that were not dealt with in previous generations. It was through the committee's process of halakhic creativity that led, for example, to the decision to begin ordaining women in the movement, and then ordaining LGBTQ rabbis and officiating at gay and lesbian marriages. In Judaism, our deepest commitment to our tradition and what it stands for in the world sometimes shows up not as a passive acceptance of what we've inherited, but as a profound frustration with that status quo and a refusal to let the story end where it currently stands. To love Torah and to be engaged in the world as a Jew is very often to feel uncomfortable with the way that things are. To love our tradition is to argue with it, to wrestle with it, to keep drawing it closer to the moral horizon toward which, on the grandest scale, it still points. With this perspective, the laws in the Torah itself become part of a very long evolution of justice that began before Sinai and continues long after Sinai. And it's our privilege and responsibility as inheritors of our tradition to see ourselves as participants in that ongoing process of tikkun, of repair, of the evolution of our tradition and how it gets lived out in the world. To simply turn away from the parts that make us uncomfortable would be an abdication of our spiritual and halakhic inheritance. Dr. Marjorie Lehman, I'm looking up there because she's usually sitting right there, my teacher at JTS and a BJ member, has done really extensive research on the topic of slavery in rabbinic literature. And in a paper called Unshackling Our Interpretive Practices, Rereading Rabbinic Slavery, Dr. Lehman and Rabbi Dr. Mira Beth Wasserman write about what they see as the very high spiritual price that we pay when we brush aside difficulties in the text rather than engage with them head on and allow them to lead us into action. This is what they write. There is a moral cost to turning away from slavery in our tradition. So long as we deny the ethical failings of our texts, we cannot redeem them. In our view, Reckoning with the realities of slavery in our text is imperative not only because doing so disrupts apologetics that are dishonest, but because it can contribute to a reckoning with our own individual and collective responsibilities. More honest readings enable us to hold these texts up to the world and ask ourselves, are we doing better today? They prompt us in our modern day communities to evaluate whether we have moved far enough in a more ethical direction, and they foster the conversations about what we need to do to garner change. End quote. In other words, honest readings of our most difficult and painful texts train us to not only become more sensitive to injustice in the text, but to injustice in the world, and to discern what our role should be in its tikkun, in its repair. When we feel ourselves become enraged by a particular verse or a particular rabbinic idea, we should first investigate why it's making us enraged, and then we should consider whether we're doing what we can in our own world, in our own time, in our country, in our neighborhood, to bring about the kind of justice we wish we saw in the text. Honest readings encourage us to harness the potential energy of a rabbinic tradition which refuses to believe that the present is the final draft of creation. We can either accept the reality that we inherited with resignation, or we can roll up our sleeves and let that righteous anger sharpen our imagination and chart a path forward. We're living through a time in which we feel the chasm between society as it currently functions or dysfunctions and the moral world in which we wish to live. We carry an ache as we watch systems fail to reflect the compassion and dignity that we believe that they were designed to protect. And the discomfort that we feel when we encounter something like slavery and Mishpatim in some ways mirrors that ache. Part of what makes this and other passages in Parashat Mishpatim such a potent spiritual teacher for us is that reading it invites us to remain awake to that ache, to remain sensitive to what it is in our texts and in our world that feels unfinished and unjust, and to step into that unfinishedness and refuse to let what is ossify into what will always be. So, can we read this week's Parsha as a step-by-step guidebook for how to live a moral life? Not exactly, or at least not in a simple and easily recognizable way. But we can read it as an invitation into a lifelong project that began at Sinai and continues today, one in which wrestling with Torah becomes the very training ground that we need to become the people capable of repairing our broken world. Shabbat Shalom.